Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a deeper look at the most important or interesting aviation story of the past week with the AIN editor who covered it. I'm AIN News Editor Chad Trotvetter. In this episode, AIN Senior Editor Kerry Lynch talks about the lack of gender diversity in the aviation industry. This applies especially to female pilots, aircraft maintenance technicians, and company CEOs. She outlines the problem laid out in a new federal committee report and then explains what trade association Women in Aviation International is doing about the problem, including what happened at the organization's annual conference earlier this month in Nashville, Tennessee. This podcast is sponsored by Business Aviation Sustainability Solutions Company, 4Air. So, Kerry, you went to the Women in Aviation conference earlier this month. Right after was the show was a Women in Aviation Advisory Board, which is a government committee, and they had some things to say about women in the workforce. And I know that women in the workforce was a topic at the conference too. So let's define the problem first before we get into what the WAI show was like.
Okay, Chad, that it's really a timely topic because Congress in the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018 established this Women in Aviation Advisory Board to address the issue of a gender gap in aviation across all disciplines that doesn't seem to change all that much. And so they pulled together a panel of 30 women who are very accomplished in the industry and who got together, and they looked at all different aspects of what the problem is, from culture to recruitment to retention. And a key part of it is the data. There isn't a whole lot of data on women in the workforce, believe it or not. But one of the key people who've been studying it, Dr. Becky Ludy, who's with the University of Nebraska's Omaha Aviation Institute, have begun doing surveys, and the group at large have begun digging into the research and having a bunch of different focus groups and just finding out where are we. And what they found or confirmed is what they know is that the numbers percentage wise have not really changed all that much in 6 decades. Over the past 60 years, the relatively percentage wise small number of women that were involved across all disciplines are about the same as today. So, in most of the major fields, the major jobs that you would think about in aviation, women account for, say, 20% or less, they found. And the big three are pilots, which they represent about 4.6%, CEOs, head of aviation organizations, 3%, and then maintenance technicians 2.6%. So those are pretty small numbers for a giant field. And of course, it's super important right now because we have a pilot shortage, or we have a looming pilot shortage. We have a maintenance workforce shortage. We have manufacturing shortages. Everybody in the industry are is really starting to get concerned. How are they going to, keep up with demand? And we especially see that in business and aviation, where they've had to curb services because they do not have the workforce.
Women are roughly more than half the population, and with such small numbers, that means there's a lot of opportunity to bring more women in. So, what's being done?
That's a great way to look at it, is opportunity, and that's what this advisory board was really focused on. One of the things, several of the members of the board were actually at the Women in Aviation conference, which occurred just days before the board held their last meeting. And they talked a little bit about this, and they stressed that it was no one issue, no one problem. And what they were looking forward to how to take advantage of opportunities and bring in more women into the workforce. And so what the board did is they put together a report. It's about 70 pages long. They had something like 55 recommendations. that went to either Congress or industry or DOT or multiple government groups or a combination thereof. And they looked at different aspects on how to, develop mentorship to keep people in the workforce, how to recruit, going to, young girls, how to retain people by incentives and, little things like changing uniforms or providing uniforms that better fit women. That sounds like a small thing, but it's a thing. To how to provide grants and loans to take care of financial barriers, how to reach into minority segments that really have been passed over for years. And so there are many different aspects that are looking at.
I guess the rubber meets the road at the WAI conference. So, what is WAI doing specifically to bring more women into the aviation industry?
The conference is a great gathering because it brings together women from all aspects of the industry. It kind of has this reputation of being for students who want to become airline pilots, and that's certainly an important part of it. But they bring together all sorts of women to help them connect and inspire and mentor. And a big thing they do is they give out scholarships every year. This year, there was roughly about 450, almost 500,000 in scholarships awarded to women who are aspiring to go into various fields of aviation, and that helps them. They bring in motivational speakers, people who have overcome obstacles or who are at the pinnacles of their career, or you know who who decide to become an airline pilot at the age of 54. It's they bring in all sorts of women to inspire and say, this is my story, this is how it can be done. One of the key things that happens in women in aviation, and it was especially prevalent this year, is they have all these sessions from hiring groups. They're private sessions where anybody's welcome to come and look at the job opportunities and how to get a job and what they need to do and what the qualifications are. And there's a real connection. And let me tell you, these sessions draw as many, many men as they do women, because it is the golden opportunity to get the jobs. And all sorts of airlines, and there are fractional ownership providers, and there's manufacturers, there's maintenance organizations, there's all different organizations who are hosting these sessions. So that's one way to show opportunities. And of course, the conference itself brought 170 plus exhibitors, who all of who were there and available to talk about their organizations and what they do. And they're not all companies hiring. Some of them are like the United Aviate Academy, which just started a whole new program where they're bringing pilots. It's almost like an ab initio program, from basic all through commercial and CFI and all the different ratings, up to the point where you'd get a type rating. And that academy actually has 51% women enrolled. And that academy is focused on evening the numbers and diversifying the population of pilots. There's also an opportunity to be mentors. There's all sorts of connection receptions and activities where you meet people who could mentor you along with your career. And there's all sorts of advice on professional and personal development, on how to look for jobs and how to mentor and how to reach out to others. There's just many, many aspects to this conference to help build and develop young women and men who decide to attend in their future, and maybe even not so young women.
Before we get into the actual keynotes and kind of the mood of the show, let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor, 4Air. Okay, and so we're back with Kerry. So, Kerry, what was the mood of the show like? What did the keynote speakers have to say? And what's the plan forward going next year?
So this year's show was held from March 17th to 19th in Nashville. It was the 33rd edition of WAI, and it drew about 4,500 attendees. And when the mood was, I would say it was a very happy, upbeat, positive event. And part of it, and I think this is true with every single aviation event, people were just happy to get back together. And so last year was held virtually, and I had talked to WAI CEO Allison McKay, and she said virtual is great, but there's nothing like connecting in person. And WAI is all about connecting. So it was very important. Um, the one thing she told me, and um, Linda Markham, who's the head of Cape Air and who was the outgoing CEO, both said they'd never seen the industry like this, where there were so many job openings. So there was a lot of focus on hiring and developing at this conference. When I went down to the conference floor, and I've been to a number of these now, it was just packed throughout the entire conference. I'd never seen it like that before. Usually when an exhibition opens, uh, you you have a lot of people there, and then as the conference goes on, the exhibit hall starts to wane, and that whole initial rush ebbs off. And that just wasn't the case this time. So people were very engaged. I went to the opening reception where they honored Wally Funk, and it was filled. And of course, Wally was honored with the National Aeronautic Association Stinson Trophy, and she got up on stage and rattled her hands and said, "I just love my life." She was so honored to be there, but it was that kind of enthusiasm that people who go are exposed to. And then she's in the crowd taking pictures with people, notables like John and Martha King. John King told AIN later that this was his favorite conference because of how supportive it is to bringing people into the industry and keeping them in the industry.
So, what did some of the other speakers have to say then?
One of the big highlights to me personally of the conference are the general sessions. They bring in amazing people who get up there and um, just blow you away with their thoughts, their inspirations. This year, they had a young woman named Nilafar Rahmani, who was the first fixed wing Afghan Air Force pilot, female pilot. I think I said first female fixed wing pilot in the Afghan Air Force. And she got up and told a story that, I just even talking about it gives me chills about what she did to overcome obstacles to get to that point. And she lived in a war torn country. They had to escape a number of times. She grew up under a tent with no water, no electricity. There were no women's rights, so she got no access to education. And yet she had a family. Her family was shamed because they gave birth to her, because it's not good in her culture to have females. Everybody wants a male, and yet they supported her dream, her vision to become a pilot. And to her, she said it was more therapy than anything, and she knew in doing so that it would endanger her. And in fact, the Taliban not only gave death threats to her family, said they had to escape here to the US, and they're living under political asylum. And she's trying to tell her story to raise awareness and to foster support for women's rights. And she was just one of them. Jennifer Hominy, who's the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board, got up and gave her story about being persistent and resilient and persevering to achieve your goals. And it was interesting because I learned a little bit about her and how she got into her role. She came from the House Transportation Infrastructure side. She was a key aide on that committee, not in aviation, but in other areas. She wanted that role, she said, because in her job on the committee, she needed to learn about transportation. So she kept going over to the NTSB, and she would spend hours and hours and hours there researching and learning. And she really, really grew an affinity for what this organization was and what it does. But as noteworthy as her speech and interesting as it was, perhaps she was upstaged just a tiny bit, and I don't think she'd mind my saying this, by her 12-year-old daughter, who got up and read a speech that she had written about her own passion for aviation and how her mother had inspired her to go in that direction, and how watching her mother achieve her goals was inspiring her to go after her own goals. And, she talked about that this is where she's going to pursue, and she has the confidence now because of her mother. So, that the speakers ranged from General Jacqueline Van Ovost, who is the highest ranking female in the U.S. military, who talked about the mentors and role models along her career. And she gave a quote that, really struck with me. She said, "I want us to reach a place where there are no firsts and where women are foundational at every level." And it's so remarkable to see these women and the barriers they break. But their goal is to say, oh, we're all doing it. Joan Sullivan Garrett, she was the founder of MedAir and chair, and she talked about her path from being a flight nurse to creating this global company, and how she was inspired to do it. And actually, it was a rather tragic story that she was on a case where she had a small child, maybe 3 years old, die in her arms, and there wasn't the appropriate medical care in the remote areas of Arizona to treat him. And so that became a calling for her to build flight kits and have telemedicine and access to better care for remote accidents, and actually globally for all different scenarios. So those were just a few. Carol Hobson, she's another one. She was the one I mentioned earlier about being the pilot who became a pilot at age 54, an airline pilot at age 54. And this is a woman who is very accomplished. She was a reporter. She worked for the NFL. She worked for Foot Locker. She was a executive with L'Oreal, but she never lost sight of her goal of becoming a pilot. And so she did. So, I know I'm missing a few in there, but they're really inspiring stories. They're all different stories. In Chad, if you let me go back to Rahmani, she also had a couple quotes that were in a video that they played showing a little bit about her life story that also really stuck with me. She said, "If I do what is easy today, my life would be hard tomorrow. I am human first, not just a woman. If I don't fight for my rights, who is going to do it? If I don't fight for my rights now, when am I going to do it?"
I think that's a good that's a good ending of a summary to the Women in Aviation Conference. So, where is the conference next year, and when are the dates?
So the conference next year are February 23 to 25 in 2023 in Long Beach, California.
So if there's any women out there who want to get into the aviation industry, you don't have to wait till then, but you're certainly more than welcome to come to the next year's conference, even if you're already starting your education. In fact, you might even be able to snag a scholarship, right?
That's right. Maybe one of 450,000.
All right. Thanks, Kerry. Thanks for listening to AINdebrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest aviation news from AIN.